Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for the 21st SF Doc Fest. The festival is being held June 1st through 12th and presented at the Roxy Theater as well as online. We are joined here today with the filmmaker Irene Lutzig with her film Contents Inventory, which is screening online as well as in person in the Keep It On program, which will be presented live at the Roxy on Sunday, June 5th at 2 p.m. Irene, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate having the opportunity to share this story. I just want to kick off by, talking about Contents Inventory, what was the genesis of the film and what drew you to telling this story?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for showing the film. It's meaningful, I think, to show this work in a local kind of Bay Area festival and context. Yeah, so this film, first of all, it's made with my neighbors, and I think that's really important. It's not necessarily visible in the film that I'm really close to this story, but this is my neighborhood that I lived in for 12 years that largely burned down. My own home we were incredibly lucky that our home was standing with only smoke damage at the end of this massive wildfire, but the fire was like it was the end of our street burned down. So it was very, very close to our home. So a lot of the kind of land you see in the film and the spaces are extremely close to where I lived for so long. Kirsten, the second person that you meet in the film, her property is just one street up from mine. So like really, really close. So really, I think the genesis was being in the middle of this huge community collective trauma as this was happening. And I think I never ever would have made a film like this had I not been extremely close to these people in this community. Even though you don't see it in the film, I think both the ways that people were open to inviting me to their properties in these incredibly difficult moments and sharing, I think all of that really happened very directly because of kind of my closeness and my position and the fact that I was already part of the community. I think even then I felt really weird about, filming someone's burned property or making ruin porn or making these kinds of like disaster images that we see really thoughtlessly in the news all the time. But I think just because of this incredible level of what felt like collaboration and consent and generosity and kind of post-trauma community sharing, it felt really different to make a project like that in this way and to make it over a long time. I think there's a kind of way that news cameras show up like immediately after a crisis and like make all these images and go home. And I think what was very apparent to me and to my neighbors is that this kind of recovery process is incredibly long. And in fact, most of my neighbors are still very much in the middle of their recovery process, and most of them are not even rebuilding yet. So it's not like I think we're used to these kind of fast and quick images of natural disaster. But I think it felt important to me to think about it as a very slow process, and a kind of, slow and ongoing process that I could really spend a certain kind of time with because I was already in the community.
Thank you for sharing that. It's interesting to think about, and I think that's definitely, it's so present in the subtext of your work that you're dealing with an event that happened that's coupled with a lot of different factors, right? We have natural disaster, we have climate change, we also have extreme income disparities. When you think about the destruction that happened on one of the most expensive areas in the Bay Area in California, combined with a global pandemic, right? There are so many stressors that everyone's going through, and it's interesting to explore that through tactile objects, right? Like as kind of your lens in, right? What does it objects mean in the face of so many hardships? And I think that your film does a really beautiful job kind of showing this humanity and intimacy within that. Could you speak to kind of your process of working with your subjects? Obviously, they were your neighbors, you are familiar with them already, but how did you approach them for this? And what was that process like for you?
Yeah, and actually I hadn't met any of these people before we filmed. It's the funny part. So we were kind of in the same community But that community is a mountain community that's fairly spread out, and where a lot of people move to the Santa Cruz Mountains because they want to kind of be off the grid and have their land and have their space. So it's not necessarily the kind of yet like dense and interactive community where you necessarily know all your neighbors. So even though I had this kind of insider position of like having also been through a version of, we were displaced for 2 months, we were also dealing with an insurance claim around smoke damage. So I had this kind of insider access, but I didn't know any of those people before. So most of the people came into my project actually through there were a lot of kind of fire recovery Facebook groups that sprung up, kind of insurance groups and recovery groups and neighbor groups. So kind of all these new forms of community that kind of started emerging while everyone was dealing with this crisis. So that's how most of those people found out about my project. And yeah, for me, it was really an invitation of, again, I never would have wanted to film with anyone who didn't feel like they would get something out of the opportunity to share or be part of a project. And a lot of people, lots of people at first were excited to be in the project and would then like get in touch with me a couple weeks later and be like, I'm not ready, or the grief is still too hard, or, I can't do it yet, or I don't want you to film on my land because it's too upsetting. So really the people in the film are the people who wanted to be in a project like this. And yeah, I almost thought of it as like a like post-fire like service I could offer of just being a witness and being a listener and being able to meet people where they were and kind of take in what they wanted to share. Yeah, but I think like lots of people would not have wanted to be in a film like this for lots of good reasons.
Of course. Obviously, this is a personal thing that you also lived through. Did you find this process cathartic at all?
Yeah, it was very hard. I mean, it was actually very emotional. And again, that's not necessarily in the kind of text of the film. It may be in the subtext, but even so where the fire damage is actually, you have to kind of drive into the mountains to even see it. So if you drive up Highway 9, which is kind of the main artery from Santa Cruz into the mountains, you would never, there's some sign, like kind of, we love you fire victim signs, but you don't see damage and you wouldn't, like it looks surprisingly normal even shortly after the fire. So you kind of need to drive up and into the hills to really see the damaged areas. And yeah, even that process of like driving like into it, and you can see it's like green trees, and then suddenly it's like ash, dead trees, and there's like a hard line where you can see where the fire got to. So yeah, it was hard. It was super hard even to just put myself back into those landscapes over and over again. But yeah, it did feel cathartic, and it felt like, yeah, again, just kind of making a space for for the like slowness and slow temporality of grief that I think is often I think missed in work that's kind of faster and more immediate about crisis like this.
Yeah, I found it very interesting that you, like you said, when you see other imagery looking at these kinds of events, it's very like there's a hero narrative that you often see, right? Like here comes the saviors and here we go, and we don't often take time to examine what's left behind. I think that that's a really special nuance of the film.
Yeah, even rebuilding is a kind of hero in it, right? There's this narrative of like, we're gonna stay here and we're gonna just build it back, and even just that process is so hard. And I think there's so much that we often don't see. And the kind of insurance inventory process, that's kind of one of the central metaphors of the film, is that's just the beginning. And that inventory takes people years to work through, just because it's traumatic and it's hard to remember everything and it's hard to find all the receipts. And that's just like step one of like 50 steps that are equally difficult before you can actually break ground and rebuild.
Yeah. You had mentioned that you were exploring similar themes in some of your new work. I think you were talking about in Colorado. Is there?
That's not for a film. So my new film is actually in Eastern Washington. I was in Colorado for different work, for academia work. Yeah, my new project is still in the West, but in Eastern Washington State.
Got it. So yeah, do you want to talk about your new project that you're working on, or are there things that link?
Yes and no. It's funny. So this fire film was kind of a COVID film also for me, because I couldn't shoot the big project that I was in the middle of a feature film that I started in 2019 when both COVID hit and then the wildfire hit. So for basically all of 2020, I was unable to work on the feature, and then this thing happened right in my neighborhood, and then I started filming with my neighbors. In part while I was waiting to be able to travel again and be in the field. So the feature is kind of a portrait of a community in Eastern Washington. The town that I've been filming in is Richland, Washington, which is a town that was built in the 40s to be a kind of nuclear worker company town for the workers who were brought from all over the country to manufacture plutonium during World War II. So this was a kind of secret Manhattan Project town where workers made the Nagasaki bomb plutonium, and then like 2/3 of the Cold War nuclear arsenal plutonium. So community really shaped by kind of the military and by a certain kind of pride and love for plutonium, which I'm really interested in. The high school mascot is a mushroom cloud. So it's this kind of exploration, exploration of kind of conservative America and kind of structural forces that shape people's worldviews in that community. So yeah, maybe not so connected, but still like thinking about the American West and its histories.
And site-specific and community-based.
Site-specific,
so it's really
collaborative. I've been really, like, it's very important to me to kind of keep a really feminist framework, no matter who I'm working with, in terms of giving people agency and kind of inviting people into a sharing process that feels collaboratively built and kind of dialogue and listening centered. So yeah, still using a lot of the same methods.
Yeah. Lovely.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's all the time we have for our Q&A today, but thank you so much for sharing this story. I know, especially for those of us that live in areas or grow up in areas that have been affected in this way, I think it's really important to show those that are left behind and kind of that coping mechanism. So again, thank you so much for being here, and we can't wait to see what comes out next.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. Thanks for showing the film.